I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Thomas Verny before, and I've got him back because he's written a very interesting article titled "The Complex Crisis Facing Men Today." And it's a really interesting review of one of these issues that I think have really come up of note of late, where numerous different commentators are talking about the challenge of masculinity. Some people are calling toxic masculinity, and then people reacting that, no, it's a problem and we've got to address it. And other people say, no, it's not a problem at all. It's men have been had this privileged position forever, and they're just complaining that they've lost this privileged position. Dr. Thomas Verny is a fascinating person. He's a clinical psychiatrist. He's an academic. He's an award-winning author. He's a public speaker. He's a poet, and he's a podcaster. He is the author of 8 books, including the global bestseller, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, and 2021's The Embodied Mind, Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies. And as I mentioned, I've had the pleasure of interviewing him before, so it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Verny back again. So, Dr. Verny, what is the complex crisis facing men today, sir?
Well, Brian, I think you put it very well in the introduction. Different people seem to have a different view of it, but there is simply no doubt that men are having a problem with identity. Of course, men are not one homogeneous entity. There are young men, there are older men, there are retired men, there are men who are racialized, there are immigrant men. There are, men who are working like yourself, white-collar men, white-collar jobs. Then there are men who are working on farms. So, all of these different groups have different problems. So I just want to make it very clear that, it's not all men who are having the problems that, as you said in your introduction, a lot of journalists and other people, politicians, for example, are calling a crisis. And the problem is that particularly young men are having problems finding a job. That's a really, really big problem. And especially when they don't have a formal education beyond high school, let's say, and also if they don't have if they are not like plumbers, electricians, people who have really good, what do you call those jobs? It's escaping me for the moment.
Skilled labor?
Skilled labor, right. So people who are essentially out of high school but have no specialized training, either in those skilled labor markets or, of course, in computers, they are having huge problems. So that's one thing. The other thing is that sort of the definition of masculinity has really changed. At one time, we had the Westerns. We had, Jerry, we had like Gunsmoke, for example, or Have Gun Will Travel, which was one of my favorites. I love that show, probably before your time. But masculinity was very clearly defined, like strong, silent, honest, a good provider, looked after the family or looked after the estate. Much of that has sort of disappeared. Being strong and silent is definitely not in vogue.
You've got to be empathetic and vulnerable and open.
Exactly, exactly. And that, for many young people, even today, is seen as soft. Okay? Oh my God. Some people might even think I'm gay if I am too soft, right? So there's confusion. Confusion is reigning. Women, I mean, as a psychiatrist, over the years, I've seen many, many couples. And it's almost the same refrain that I hear from the wife. He never talks to me about his feelings. That's usually what I have gotten over the years and still get. Men are not good at talking about their feelings. And some of that, as I explain in my article, some of that is just simply biological. Men are, in terms of their brains, different from women. Women have a much better connection between the two parts of the brain, the left and the right brain. Men don't have that good connection. It's called the corpus callosum, and it's like a bridge that connects the two brains. And women that way are much more intuitive. They are much more in touch with their feeling. And also, their language is more developed than men. So they don't have any problems talking about their feelings. Men have problems just biologically, but also culturally, because strong, silent is still, in many quarters, seen as the best way for a man to be. So we have all these problems, but I think I should make it very clear that women have their problems too. It's not just men, okay? There is this vitriol against women in power, as we have seen in the elections, for example, in the United States recently, but it's all over the world, There's a rise in domestic violence and femicide. There is persistent pay inequality with women. In Canada, in western part of Canada, where there are a lot of Native women, they have been abused. They have been killed at a much higher rate than men have been killed. So I think all of us are having problems. And I think it is so important to realize that we have these problems and that we need to do something about it.
The issue that you talk about in regards to men not getting jobs is far larger, is it not? The comments that people have mentioned and that the statistics I think bear out is that they're not just finding getting jobs difficult, it's finding relationships, it's finding meaning, it's finding identity, it's finding a place in society. Let me quote from your article, if I could. You say, whether in Appalachia or anywhere else, men feel left out, not needed or not valued. The likelihood of them becoming depressed and suicidal or angry and violent increases exponentially. They also occupy a growing presence in the manosphere, a loose network of communities that claim to address men's struggles. These groups are united by an opposition to feminism and cast men as victims of the current social and political climate. I heard Governor Newsom of California recently, and he was talking about how graduation rates for males in secondary, post-secondary, and for sure in graduate programs diminishing dramatically, such that he thinks that in 10 years there's going to be 1/3 male, 2/3 female graduates of post-secondary educations in California. How suicide rates have doubled, if not more than doubled, in California for young men. And he talked about how in his own Democratic Party, the vast majority of people, not just females, but people, dismiss this as completely irrelevant, and they don't see it. And politically, in the last election, both Donald Trump in the United States and Pierre Poilievre in Canada exploited this, and you saw a dramatic increase in young men voting for right-wing parties. So this is more than just not getting jobs. What's going on?
Well, it's a feeling of displacement, as I have put it, in my piece for the Globe and Mail. Confusion, and when there are people, particularly on the internet, who promise you easy solutions to very complex problems, young men are attracted to that. There is also a lack of education in many parts of the Western world, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada, where very often children are not taught to really analyze a problem. In other words, to look at it in terms of pros and cons, to debate things, to discuss, as you and I are right now, different views. This is less and less taught in schools. And so a lot of people don't have the capacity to, let's say, read something or hear something on the internet and actually think about this. Like, is this really logical? Does this make sense? What is the evidence? Nobody is teaching them that.
We're going to have to take a break for some messages. And when I come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Verny about, some of the negative side effects of some of the negative impacts of this trend, this manosphere that he talks about. But frankly, that manosphere has become, almost this toxic masculinity, this incels, these, the typified by this description, which may or may not be accurate, of young men in their mother's basements playing video games and not being able to form relationships. And what's going on? We're going to take a break and come back with Dr. Verny in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Dr. Thomas Verny with us tonight. He is a clinical psychiatrist. He's an academic. He's an award-winning author, public speaker, poet, and podcaster. And he's recently written a fascinating column in the Globe and Mail called "The Complex Crisis Facing Men Today." Men, especially young men, are reacting to a rapidly changing world. Let me, if I could, sir, just read a little bit from your article again, if I could. You say, Richard Weaves, a British-American scholar, argues that men are struggling to adapt to rapid and unsettling social transformations. He contends that the advancement of women's rights, combined with the economy's move from physical labor to knowledge-based work, has deprived many men of what Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing called ontological security, a stable sense of identity. Reeves warns that men now face the danger of becoming culturally redundant. Culturally redundant. We've heard these comments about these incel organizations, communities of young men that blame females for all of their ills, that are living in their mother's basements, that are playing video games, that can't form relationships, that can't find dates, that can't find partners, that aren't getting married, that are not having kids, that are not getting mortgages and houses. And they're blaming feminism and women's liberation and women for their problems, and an overalized feminine school system or feminism of the school system. Gavin Newsom talks about no male role models. Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, said that particularly in the black community, this was a real problem with lack of male role models, and he challenged fathers that they got to play a far bigger role. It's almost as if everything you just described about sort of the bonanza or Gunsmoke or a strong male role model of the past is no longer looked upon as positive. And what's happening is that you either have to be this effeminate, empathetic, vulnerable, almost feminized version, or you end up being this toxic masculinity version. What's going on, sir? How do you see this?
Well, as you put it, those two extremes, the toxic, vulgar, aggressive male or the feminized male, are the two extremes, really. And what we have to do is to try to find some space in the middle. I think that Obama and Newcomb and many others who have spoken on this are right. In some ways, young children only get female teachers. I don't know whether I put it in my article or not, because it has been some time since I've written it. But for example, from the moment that children are born, mothers and fathers relate differently to their children depending on their sex. If the child is female, the mother will speak differently, much more emotionally to her daughter, and the father will do sort of much more rambunctious, sort of athletic things with his little son, like throw him up in the air and catch him, or just sort of, play kind of rough and tumble games, which he would not with the daughter. So gradually, right from the moment that children are born, they're treated differently. When they go to kindergarten, when they go to nursery school, it's always female teachers who they have. In public school, it's mostly female teachers. One of my friends was going to volunteer to look after some sea cadets in Hamilton, and he found that whereas a few years ago there were something like 75 sea cadets in Hamilton, now there are only 15. And one of the reasons is that they have got 2 female officers, whereas in the past they had male officers. So imagine sea cadets having 2 female officers. Like, this is not a good role model for boys, no matter how competent the female officer may be. Not when you are trying to learn about boyhood masculinity. So having more males in the teaching professions, having more males at universities, that would really, really help. But the most important thing is to try to get focused on the middle between those 2 extremes that you have just mentioned. Because the people on the extremes are very persuasive. They have a strong presence on the internet, whereas people like you and I, who I think, would tend to be more in the middle, don't have such a strong voice. And so people are being like a magnet. They're just being pulled in these extremes, and that's the problem. Because once you have those 2 extremes, they dislike each other. There is antagonism. There is a lot of dislike and fighting and violence, and the world is just going further and further into a terrible mess.
But the right wing, Pierre Poilievre, Donald Trump, and some of the commentators, whether they be Josh Rogan or others in the United States and in Canada, have really appealed to this I'm not going to suggest toxic masculinity, but this very strong masculine attitude that's almost anti-feminine at times, and certainly maybe not feminine, but feminism, and women's liberation. I've interviewed people that have talked about the problem being the 1960s and the sexual revolution and the pill and abortion, that gave females a very different opportunity, and that took away that opportunity from men and changed sort of society fairly dramatically, and that women have adapted to that and have adapted well, but men haven't adapted. And it's almost as if some of these men are blaming women. And again, to quote your article, if I could, a number of men in the West believe that women are ascending to positions of prestige and power that they once held. It is a kind of cultural teeter-totter. Women are seen as rising triumphant, while men in free fall feel defeated and angry. It's hard to measure, but it seems to me an equal number of women must think just the opposite, given the erosion of reproductive rights, the rise in domestic violence, and femicide, persistent pay inequality, and the vitriol women in power face daily online and in the media. So women aren't happy.
Men are not.
Men are devastated.
Yes. Yes. Well, another problem that we have not mentioned and that I run up against when I speak to men in particular is this wokeism that's going on, okay? Like this sort of changing of terms that we have always used into something else. For example, in schools, you cannot say student. You have to say learner. In my own particular area, which has for a long time been psychiatry and obstetrics, you cannot say breastfeeding woman. You have to say, are you ready for this? Chest feeding women. Chest feeding people, sorry, not breastfeeding. You cannot say pregnant women. You have to say pregnant people. This is ridiculous. I have never met a pregnant non-woman. And you can't say problems. You have to say challenges. So men feel that they are being force-fed what they see are these sort of feminist ways of looking at the world. And they don't like it. Men also, by and large, biologically and also historically, tend to be more conservative than women. They are conservative because, like you just mentioned, they had prestige, they had power, and they see that losing. So obviously they don't like it. But
so is this just a power grab then, that men don't like the fact that power has been taken away from them, that money has been taken away from them, that the obligation for a female to submit to them in a marriage that would have been an attitude that I've actually heard recently, but that is probably an attitude from the 1950s and before, have been taken away. Is this just greed or jealousy that men just want the power back again?
I think that it's mostly unconscious. I don't think that they really, if you spoke to a man about this, they probably would not admit to it. But I think it's there. And the sort of the need to blame someone is very human, okay? When a person goes wrong in any which way, the immediate knee-jerk reaction is to blame someone, not me. Wasn't my fault. My wife made me do it, right? I didn't do it. Oh, in the United States, it's the immigrants, okay? Or it's the blacks, the greens, the yellows, whatever, just not me. So there is this kind of a reaction to blame women when actually, all they have done really is to get back equality, which they definitely deserve. Of course, we should all be equal. But for men, it seems like they are better off than they were, and therefore there's resentment.
I want to come back to feminism and femininity in a minute, and females, if I could. But before I go there, you do talk about socialization a lot in your article, about how mothers and fathers treat their offspring, male or female, very differently. But you also talk, which I found quite interesting, about the role of testosterone and estrogen. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Tell us, as a doctor, as a clinical psychiatrist, what is the role of testosterone and estrogen?
Yeah, well, they're very different. Obviously, they're the main sex hormones that we have. Both in men and women, from the moment that you are actually conceived or very shortly after, in males, you start producing testosterone, and in women, estrogen, and that is going to shape and sculpt your brain and the rest of your body, of course, as it's developing. But from my perspective, most importantly, it's really the brain. I mean, obviously, the sexual organs and all that will be influenced by testosterone and estrogen and progesterone and many of the other hormones. But testosterone is the one that really is most influential in men, and it has a kind of aggressive component to it. It makes a person more ready to become physical, whether that is just work or whether it's violence. When there is testosterone, when there is a lack of serotonin, which is another hormone in the body, neurohormone, then very often that will increase violence or propensity to a tendency to violence. Whereas estrogen is a much more calming hormone. And then there are other hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin, again, very different. In males and females. Oxytocin is produced much more in women, vasopressin much more in men. And again, vasopressin is a more aggressive hormone. Oxytocin is a very social hormone. So women who have oxytocin and estrogen, as opposed to men who have vasopressin and testosterone, there is a real biological difference there, which does not in any way, of course, justify males becoming violent, but there is a greater propensity for violence, biologically speaking, or aggressiveness or competitiveness in men than it is in women. And
one of the things that you talk about in your article, which I think people know, but you need to be reminded about, is you talk about the role of testosterone in females. So there is estrogen in males and there is testosterone in females, correct?
Yes. And testosterone is very important in women in terms of a sexual drive, a desire to have sexual relations. And it slowly starts disappearing with age and pretty well disappears by the time menopause comes around. So then, of course, that creates some more problems, because you may be married to a man in whom there is still plenty of testosterone, but the woman has none, and so she has no sexual desire. He still has some, which might lead to some problems in the relationship.
Tell me about the role of estrogen in males.
Well, the role in estrogen in males makes them more loving, also the same as oxytocin. Interestingly enough, every time you dance, every time you have a good meal, you produce dopamine and oxytocin. And so that will make that particular activity pleasant, which means that you will want to have more of it, which is great. For women, for example, when they breastfeed, they produce oxytocin and dopamine, which will make them ready to breastfeed again. So the way nature set this up is very clever. But once you run out of oxytocin and vasopressin, which also happens over the years, there is much less and less of that in your system, and you may become less social and less interested in making friendships.
We're going to take a break for some messages. I'm going to come back in 2 minutes with Dr. Thomas Verny and talk about femininity and feminism and the female side of the equation. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Dr. Thomas Verny with us tonight. He is a clinical psychiatrist. He's an academic. He's an award-winning author, public speaker, poet, and podcaster. He's written a really interesting column recently called "The Complex Crisis Facing Men Today." And we've talked about the challenges that many men, particularly less educated in rural communities, that have lost the sort of sense of meaning. And they become, some people would describe this sort of very toxic masculinity and the description of them having problems forming relationships, finding dates, getting marriages, and developing into that model that we have of a person getting a mortgage, buying a house, having kids, forming a stable long-term relationship. And it seems to be challenged today. you don't address this in the article, but you sort of raise it right near the end and you call it as a question that females are also having some challenges. And it's interesting, Doctor, I've had numerous conversations of late that have said one of the byproducts of this is also that it is more challenging, more difficult even for some females to feel feminine, and to focus on their femininity, and that they're being told by society that they've got to be more like a man, that they've got to be more successful in their career, they've got to get a job, they've got to be in the workforce, and that to take time to be a mother, to be a housewife, to be feminine, is frowned upon by society. So have females been impacted by this sort of trend as well?
Well, yes. As as you put it, you put it very correctly. There is a strong now movement, particularly in the United States, where again, there are some highly, popular. I was going to say respected, but I think I would rather like to say popular. There are popular speakers, popular women speakers, who attract hundreds and thousands of women to their websites and to some of their conferences, where they tell women that they should stop working, and become housewives again and have children. I mean, this huge sort of focus on having children is incredible in the 21st century. What we are witnessing is like a real, going back to the 17th century or something. And the more children you have, the better. And in this article that I wrote in the Globe and Mail, I'm quoting one woman. I think her name was Clark. Do you have my paper in front of you by any chance?
I do. I'm looking for it right now, sir.
Okay. So am I. Where are we? It's towards the end. Let's see.
What were you saying?
I was saying about the fact that there are some women now, very popular women, who are telling other women that they should not work, they should withdraw from working, and that they should have children. And like one woman by the name of Clark, I think, was telling women that she came out with this absolutely ridiculous statement: less Prozac, more protein. I'm not quite sure what she meant by that. Also, she was single and had no children, and yet she had thousands of people listening to her, telling them that they should have children. So again, I'm coming back to the fact that people have just not learned to question, to analyze, to ask questions about, like, how does this make sense?
So, what do we do about this? And you end with this saying that you're not quite sure what the remedy is. But let's talk about this a little bit. If we've had this big trend in society that was affected by the sexual revolution in the 1960s, by the pill, by women's liberation, by abortion, etc., and assuming that we believe that equality is admirable and something that we want, and that control over your reproductive rights is something that we think is positive, and that misogyny is bad. You go through the things, but at the same time, what is happening, it would appear, is that maybe because of globalization, maybe because of technology, maybe because of a lot of other trends, there is this segment of society that is young men in rural communities or former blue collar communities that are, as you say, finding meaning, not finding meaning, and being in despair. That suicide is up, that graduation rates are up, that I understand addictions are up. All trends that we don't like, so that men are feeling challenged, particularly young men are feeling challenged in their maleness and in their desire for success. And some females are finding challenges in their inability to, or at least society's restrictions on their ability to be feminine and take what would have been historically feminine choices. How do we how do we how do we address all this? Do we just not? Or do we have to do something about it? Because right now it would appear that at least the right wing commentators are taking advantage of this lack of meaning that people are faced with and struggling with, and are developing either, as you say, this almost step for wife kind of attitude within conservative females, or this toxic masculinity trend within males. And we saw it in Canada with this freedom movement during the trucker convoy. So what do we do as a society, sir?
Well, I think we start with parenting. I think that parents have to pay much more attention to their children, both male and female, and teach them both by modeling, in other words, they themselves living the right life, and also verbal attitudes, communication, what it means to be a human being in the 21st century, to be a good person, to be a thinking person, a caring person. This has to start in the home. And today, I have observed many parents leave all that stuff to the educational system. They expect that the schools are going to teach their children how to become adults. No, that cannot happen at the school level. It has to happen in the home. And I think that people have become so obsessed with material things, to have a bigger television set, to have more computers, all the usual stuff, that they spend huge amounts of time at work and hardly any time at home and hardly any time with their children. So it really has to start happening in the home. Spend more time talking to your children. Find out what their interests are. Support any sort of artistic interest or any interest that they have. And also, model through your own behavior male and femaleness that makes sense to you. In other words, do not go to those extremes that we have described, like the toxic masculinity or the very sort of feminized, sensitive male, right? And the same applies to women. You don't want someone who hates men become one of those, really hateful feminists, nor do you want to become someone who only wants to have children and be married and have no other sort of goals in life than having children. So I really think it has to start at home, and then it also has to start in school, right from the get-go. We got to have more male teachers. We got to have more male models everywhere. And you are a very good one. But for example, when I attended medical school, I graduated in 1961 in medicine at the U of T. I think we had about 15 women in our class, and something like 125 men. Today, the majority are women. And this is going to increase, as you put it a few minutes ago. We might come to the point where 80% of the doctors are going to be women. This, again, is not a good thing. It's not a good thing in terms of for boys to see someone like me, that I go to the doctor to, or someone who like me who teaches me. Um, we still have, we still have men in positions like, presidents of banks and, large corporations. But even that is changing, and that's fine as long as it's equal. But I think that any sort of huge majority of one sex or the other is not good for the rest of the population.
Scott Galloway, who is a professor of strategy in a business school at New York University, podcaster, has said that the problem is we don't have the appropriate male role models anymore in leadership, and I think he looks at the most senior leadership in the United States as one example of this, and he says that too often sort of the examples that we've got are men, excuse the language, being assholes, and that what we need to do is we need to remind ourselves that what used to be being a man was being strong, being generous, being a good father, being a good provider, being loving, and that sort of identity of maleness has been lost in our society today. Do you feel that, sir?
Yes, I feel that, but unfortunately, what you said in terms of, let's say, the administration in the United States, there are a lot of parents who point to that particular president and say, hey, you see, there is a man, he knows what to do. We love him. We look up to him. So you are getting really, the wrong picture, at least in your and my eyes. But, half of the population in the United States, or close to half, admire the present administration. And so that is a huge problem.
He also, criticizes our society, as I think you have, in regards to material prosperity. And he holds Elon Musk up as an example. He says, for some reason, because this guy's a billionaire, we think that he is the perfect example. But yet, he's being sued by several ex-wives right now for custody. He's got numerous different ex-wives, numerous children from numerous different marriages. Can't seem to keep a relationship. That's not what should be defined as the model of the perfect man. But he's a billionaire, so a lot of people think it is.
Well, again, I'm going back to what I said several times before. There is a lack of analysis. There's a lack of just what you now described. Look at Elon Musk. Yes, he is a billionaire, but also look at him as a human being. And the same as the president. He is a convicted felon. He has been convicted in court for trying to, I think, rape at least one woman, probably more than one. And yet people don't seem to notice that, or at least his followers minimize that totally. So again, parents have to point this out to their children, just like you have pointed it out. And those who don't seem to be able to, well, they are going to raise children who will be just like that. And this is going to be a huge problem.
If you had a young man come to your practice, sir, that was sort of this typical example of the individual that had been taken captive by toxic masculinity, that had joined incel, that was living in his mother's basement, that hated women, etc. What would you tell him?
Well, first of all, I don't tell my patients too much. I like to help them see on their own what would be the right thing to do. So if he came to me and he was unhappy and depressed, which is what I would guess would bring him to me, not a discussion of philosophy or politics. Excuse me. Well, I would try to find out what is making him depressed and why he's living in his parents' basement and why he's not going out and looking for a job. And he would probably tell me that he's not interested in anything and that he likes playing on his computer games. And then I would ask him more questions about what does he think the future holds for him. So in other words, I would like to lead him to think about his predicament or position and gradually open him up to other ways of looking at life.
You quote The Economist in your article, and it's really interesting. You say that a team of reporters from The Economist spoke with young adults in 20 countries and found a recurring theme. University-educated heterosexual women often express frustration over the shortage of well-educated, open-minded men for romantic relationships. Meanwhile, many young working-class men complain that feminism has overreached and is limiting opportunities for men. It seems like both men and women are frustrated with the current situation.
Yes, exactly. But more men than women, like a greater number of men than women. But women too are unhappy. A lot of young people nowadays, I'm sure you have been to restaurants, you see a couple, young, old, whatever, sitting, and each one of them is looking at their little cell phone, and they're not talking to each other, right? Just talking, looking at their cell phone. I understand that more and more people don't know how to make small talk. They are so used to texting, they don't know how to actually sit down with another person and talk.
Well, maybe this is going to raise one last issue that I'd like to ask you about, and the impact of social media and dating apps. Let's take a final break, and come back with some concluding comments with our guest, Dr. Thomas Verny, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Dr. Thomas Verny with us tonight. He is a clinical psychiatrist. He's written a really interesting article called The Complex Crisis Facing Men Today, and we've been chatting about it. I've got one last question to ask you about, sir. You haven't talked about this in your article, but you just mentioned the impact of social media. I read this really interesting article that said that part of the problem is social media and dating apps. And it said that on dating apps today, 80% of the attention of females goes to 20% of the men that appear to be the most wealthy. And 80% of the male attention goes to the 20% of the females that appear to be the most beautiful. So females are attracted to wealth and men are attracted to beauty. And there's a whole bunch of non-economically successful men that aren't getting any attention, aren't getting any dates. And there's a whole bunch of less than attractive females that aren't getting any dates. And it says that in a normal society, people would have met people and been happy and got married and had families and been very happy. But now you've got this, because everyone's connected, dating apps or social media or whatnot, there's way too much attention to the wealthy men and way too much attention to the beautiful females. What do you think about that, sir?
Oh boy, that's a real disaster. It's a recipe for disaster. Also, it's a recipe for lying. Like a lot of these posts on the dating sites are not true. Sometimes they don't. If they show a picture, it's not even their own picture. It's not even their own photograph. But it certainly tells you that meeting the right person is becoming more and more difficult because men are looking for something different from what women are looking for. And I don't think it's just wealth. I think that women are looking for security. It's not just money, but if the man has a good job, there is a certain degree of security. Also, many of the women are professionals or have a good job. They don't want to be involved with a guy who is not making a lot of money and actually will take away some of their money. So there are all kinds of concerns going on. Men only being interested in beauty, that's rather disappointing. I didn't know that, but it doesn't come as a surprise. But it is disappointing, and it points out the difficulty of meeting that like The Economist, for example, that you read, discussed that women are having problems in real life, like not even through ads and dating sites, but just in real life, meeting men that they find attractive, not just physically, but just an interesting person. You will never be able to really get a good idea of the person if you are just texting or corresponding. I mean, you really have to. I mean, Zoom is pretty good, but I see some patients on Zoom and I see some patients in person, and person is so much better. I mean, you just pick up more of the person when you are actually sitting with them face to face. So,
No question. I agree with you completely.
it's a good substitute. It's better than just being on the telephone, but it's not the same. And so these dating sites really are not a good way of meeting someone. It's much better way, I would say, join some interest groups, join a golf club, or join a bridge club, become a volunteer, meet people in person. You're much better off that way.
Dr. Thomas Verny, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you. Appreciate you joining us. This article was fascinating. I look forward to the next column and hopefully another conversation with you, sir. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on podcast servers, and on my YouTube website as soon as the radio show goes to air. And I get the pleasure all the time of interviewing some really fascinating people, and Dr. Verny is unquestionably one of them. Sir, really appreciate you joining us. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.